So what is a surfboard restoration? What makes one job just a repair and another job a restoration? Is it the age of the board maybe, which era it came from, who shaped it, and whether or not it's collectible and worth any money once it's restored to its original condition? But then following that path, does a restoration have to restore a surfboard back to its original condition? In order for it to be considered a restoration, does all the glass need to come off so the foam can be brought back down to bright white like it was when it was first made? But that's going to change the shape of the board. We're going to have less foam than it originally had, so it won't be that original shape anymore. Or maybe the glass on the board should be saved as much as possible, but the entire job repainted to look as though the board is brand new out of the shop. But then isn't the beauty of an old board or even an old piece of furniture the fact that it looks old and it looks vintage, and that's what makes it attractive and sets it apart from all of the brand new boards we see in surf shops today? The definition of restoration is the action of returning something to a former owner, place, or condition. But what is a surfboard's original condition? Is it just surfable and watertight, or is it bright, colourful paint, white foam, looking brand new? Following that logic, then even a firewire from the year 2020 after it's left my workshop is technically a restoration. If our firewire from the year 2020 comes in with only one ding, maybe that's a ding repair, but if the board comes in with 15 to 20 dings all over it, is that a restoration of a 2020 model surfboard? I've seen a lot of surfboard restorations over the years, both photos and videos, and I've seen all kinds of methods used to restore these surfboards. Some people strip off all of the board's fiberglass, they plane down the foam to bring it back to a brand new white, they add resin tints or paint, and they try to restore that board back to what it would have looked like when it was made brand new and sitting in a store waiting to be bought. Although this is sometimes required because the condition of the fiberglass is so bad that it needs to be removed, I think to something like vintage furniture. And I think about a TV cabinet or a bookshelf, and if the wood was rotten and I removed all of those wooden shelves and all of the paneling and replaced it with brand new timber, would it still be the same vintage piece of furniture that it was when it came to me? A friend years ago told me a story that he called Grandpa's Axe. The boy in the story had a grandfather who was a lumberjack for his entire life. He lived and breathed the forest, cutting down trees, milling timber, and he had the same axe for as long as the boy could remember. When the boy's grandfather died, the axe was passed on down to him, and the boy used it for years, always thinking of his grandfather every time he used it. But one day when he was using it, the handle snapped. He went to a friend of his grandfather's who made axe handles and fitted them, and he had this friend of his grandfather's make a new handle to mimic the one that was originally on the axe out of the same timber, and as a bonus, the friend of the grandfather had even made the original handle that was on his grandfather's axe. A few years later, he was sharpening the axe and he realised that the axe had been sharpened so many times throughout the course of its life that there wasn't really any blade to sharpen anymore. All of the metal had been worn away and used. So he took the axe to another one of his grandfather's friends who was a blacksmith. This blacksmith had forged the original head of the boy's grandfather's axe, and so the boy had him replicate that same head that he had made, forge a new one, and they mounted it to the handle that had been made to replace the original handle. So the question of the story is, does the boy still have his grandfather's axe? Does his grandfather's axe even exist anymore? In reality, the boy has a replica or an ode to his grandfather's axe, but the handle long ago ceased to exist and the original head of the axe ceased to exist. To me, stripping off all of the fiberglass from an old surfboard, planing down the foam to freshen it all up and reskinning it, even if you do it in the same fashion or manner or style that it was originally done in, it's still a story of grandfather's axe. And you might say, well, at least the original foam is still on the board, and that's true, but the foam has been changed throughout the process, so now the shape isn't the same. So it's no longer that shaper's board because he never shaped that board. His rails might have been slightly more turned down, he might have had a little bit more volume up by the nose, there might have been slightly more V in the tail, or maybe if it was a concave, you've filled that concave slightly when you fiberglassed the board, so the concave is no longer as deep as it originally was. So have you returned this surfboard to its former condition, or have you built an ode to the original surfboard from some of the original material? If we go down the second pathway, and we keep all the original glass on the board, but we heavily paint the entire thing, maybe with some 2K automotive paint, what's left of that board anymore to tell us that it is indeed vintage, it is collectible, it was shaped by somebody notable? What's left behind? Perhaps some logos are there. Everything is there, but it's underneath that paint, you can't see it. We could paint a vintage piece of furniture, we could use a period correct colour, and the texture of that timber, even some mistreatment of the paint afterwards, is going to tell the person looking at it that this is indeed a restored vintage piece of furniture. But it doesn't work the same way with surfboards. In order to paint over a surfboard, we have to have a nice, smooth surface, something that the paint will adhere to, something that's not going to let water through, something that's not going to chip and peel away as it's used. Those things won't add to the character of the surfboard, they'll take away from it. Furthermore, much of the character that comes with these old surfboards is in the form of broken or shattered fiberglass, discoloured foam, exposed weave, all those things, and if we paint over the board, we hide all of those characteristics, and those characteristics aren't possible to replicate using something like paint. So then the only other option that we're left with is my preferred method, which is basically doing as much as possible with clear resin and bringing the board back to a surfable and usable condition with confidence that the board will last another 20, 30, 40 years, or however old that board is at the time it comes into me. But I can't claim that this method is the action of returning something to a former condition. So therefore, is it a restoration, or am I merely just repairing dings on a surfboard? To me, the definition of a surfboard restoration and what sets it apart from just repairing a surfboard is the need, the want, and the importance of looking up when that surfboard was made, who shaped it, where it's come from, where it's been. The thing that defines a vintage surfboard is its history. It's not the way it once looked, it's not the way it currently looks, it's the history behind it. And a small part of that history is the imperfections in the board, the twisting, the water staining, the exposed weave, the old repairs, all those what would be considered ugly traits about any new board become part of an old board, part of that story and part of that board's history. That includes any repairs I do as well. This tail repair we're watching right now, it's becoming part of the board's history, and in another 20 or 30 years, who knows who else will add to that board's history. So personally, I don't see the sense when quote-unquote restoring a surfboard in painting the board to look brand new, or skinning the board and putting new fiberglass on freshly shaped foam. To me, that's no longer the same board, or at the very least, it hides all of the important characteristics that make the board special and worthy of paying the money to restore it in the first place. But all that being said, it occurs to me that no matter which method you prefer to do, or which method you prefer to be done to old vintage surfboards, it is not by definition possible to restore a vintage surfboard. None of these three methods can truly return these surfboards back to their former condition. And only one of these methods can show off and enhance all of the things that make these boards so attractive to the eye and let us know that we're not just looking at an everyday regular surfboard. Although I would never choose to deliberately paint an entire surfboard and hide all of its original characteristics. I do believe that there are many occasions when there's no choice but to strip off all of the original fiberglass, reshape the foam, and start again from scratch. That said though, I think that should be the very, very, very last option when it comes to trying to bring these surfboards back to life, and there's a fine line between reusing materials and what we would call restoring an old surfboard. This particular board is a Land surfboard, formerly known as Roger Land Custom Surfboards. It was purchased by Kevin Brightwell in 1965, who changed the name just to Land. They stopped production in 1966, so it's fairly safe to say that this board was made somewhere between 1965 and 1966. For the most part, we can all be pretty happy that surfboards are no longer made the way that surfboards were made in the 1960s. As stunning as boards made in this era quite often are, especially those that have somehow managed to be unridden and unseen for decades, so they're in almost pristine condition, the reality is these boards generally and comparatively surf like shit. They're a super fun novelty to have around and certainly worth having a surf on if you ever get the chance, but they're not going to become your everyday rider. And not only because they really don't surf all that well by today's standards, but also just out of practicality. They're incredibly heavy, they're hard to get on the roof of your car, they're hard to carry down to the beach, and if you lose the board and you're so lucky to have a leash attachment on a board like this, the board may pull your leg straight out of its socket. All that being said though, boards of this era or around this era have achieved something that we all are striving to achieve and purchase and support to this day, and that would be sustainability. Most of you would be pretty aware of these logos or logos like them, claiming to be part of an eco board or a sustainable surf kind of movement. Generally speaking, if the board isn't made out of 100% timber or maybe using an agave blank, the vast majority of boards sporting this stamp on it will be shaped using EPS foam and be fiberglassed with an epoxy laminate. If there's one thing that all of these EPS epoxy glass boards have in common, aside from the sustainable surf stamp plastered on them, it is that they will never become known as vintage surfboards. There is little doubt in my mind, from a ding repairer's perspective, that master shapers such as Roger Hall, Wayne Parks, Bob McTavish, Joshua Martin are making boards today that, when I'm their age, will be considered vintage boards. These are shapers who really haven't changed what shaping a surfboard was back when this board was made. They've merely updated and improved the materials they use, but they're still the same materials. Technology has just made those materials that much better, which provides us with surfboards that are that much better. The current obsession with EPS skinned with epoxy resin undoubtedly creates really well performing surfboards, and the shapers that make them are undoubtedly very talented shapers. But make no mistake, any board made in particular with EPS foam will never last as long as a board like the one I'm working on now. If you like your surfboards highly responsive with particular flex patterns and you love a bit of carbon fibre through the middle or on the rails, then by all means an EPS board with epoxy skin is probably for you. But if you're the type of person who purchases a surfboard because there's a stamp on the bottom of it that tells you it was made using sustainable methods and materials, I promise you that's not the right board for you. When talking about traditional PU and poly construction versus new age EPS and epoxy construction, there's very little that's sustainable about either one of them. Certainly if I choose to use a bio resin versus a West Systems marine epoxy, possibly my surfboard is slightly more sustainable than the one done in a marine epoxy, but that still doesn't mean to say that that board is sustainable. With the materials and chemicals that surfboards are built out of, the only real way to make a sustainable surfboard is to make one that is going to last for literal decades. To make or buy a surfboard that you will one day pass down to your children and they will then pass down to their children. And I hate to say it, but EPS is not it. Epoxy is undoubtedly a great material. It's built surfboards since the 70s, it's been used on boats since before that, and it is a remarkable resin. Albeit it can be an absolute nightmare and a pain in the ass to work with and to get to learn. It's not as straightforward as poly, but epoxy resin is a very good product. EPS, on the other hand, I believe to be a deplorable product, and I actually struggle to think of a single material that would be less suitable to create surfcraft of any kind out of, from SUPs to surfboards. There's only two ways I can really see this current obsession with EPS foam going. The first one would be that a new and better material comes along, it's as affordable or more affordable and easily available to shapers around the world. Something like agave possibly, but we're yet to find out. The only other way I can see it going is sales of EPS boards declining to a point where manufacturers no longer manufacture it. This will come from two different avenues. The first one will come from the consumer, when surfers start to realise that they're having to buy a new surfboard every year, if they're lucky every 2 years, but probably every year. The second place this will come from will probably be ding repairers. I've spoken to a lot of ding repairers over the last few years, and if we all have one thing in common, it's that we cannot stand working with EPS foam. Epoxy is inherently a difficult material to work with on its own, but EPS just makes it that much harder. I know a handful of ding repairers now who no longer offer to repair EPS boards. I know a handful of ding repairers now who are considering cutting off and no longer offering to repair epoxy and EPS boards, and I also know a handful of repairers, myself included, who are considering upping the price of fixing EPS epoxy boards quite considerably. Epoxy is an extremely expensive material in comparison to poly resin. EPS is very difficult to work with, epoxy resin is very difficult to work with, and because of the curing time of epoxy, it means that you're storing boards and they're under your liability for just that much longer. So it seems to be coming to a point where ding repairers are wondering, is it worth me fixing these boards? And if it's not, either I stop repairing them or I up the price quite considerably. If this trend amongst ding repairers does take off and come to fruition, then consumers of these surfboards are going to realise that the boards that they're buying are costing them considerably more money than if they were to purchase a poly PU surfboard, or even an epoxy over PU surfboard. It's costing them more in one way because they have to buy a replacement surfboard more often, because the core of the boards they're buying just doesn't stand up to water and pressure very well. And on the other side of the coin, it's also going to be costing them significantly more every time they need to get their board repaired, which is reasonably frequently because the density of the foam that they're riding on just can't stand up to the pressures of their surfing. This will result in less people buying EPS surfboards, and this will result in less people making EPS surfboards. The plus side to all of this, though, is that something will have to replace that EPS foam. Whatever replaces EPS foam will have to behave in a similar way, because people who ride EPS epoxy boards quite often claim that they don't like the way PU poly boards surf. Sort of makes you wonder if these people always hated surfing really before they were able to easily purchase a stringerless EPS epoxy surfboard. Whatever material the powers that be can come up with that flexes and behaves the same way as EPS does when surfed, and God forbid wouldn't rot away to nothing when it got wet, this new material will undoubtedly be more sustainable and eco-friendly than our current EPS, because that is just generally how technologies work. They get cheaper, they get easier to produce, more available, and more environmentally friendly. I like to think that in the long term, EPS will become sustainable because its use in surfcraft will lead to the invention and the use of a far superior material to both PU and EPS. But until then, if you're a person out there who has a little sustainable surf stamp on the bottom of your surfboard, just know that this 1965 Roger Land is more sustainable than your board will ever be. Short of falling off the roof of the owner's car and being hit by a semi-truck, this board will probably outlive the both of us. And I actually think that's pretty bloody cool. So what have we learnt in this video? We have learnt that the ding repair guy is pretty bloody opinionated. When you spend all day looking at surfboards and sanding and just being in your own mind, you think about a lot of things. So these are just some of the things that I think about while sanding. Agree or disagree, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was worth making it all the way through. The big question is, did you make it all the way through? If you did make it all the way through, I want you to leave in the comments a question, and the question will be, what is that black stuff you rubbed on the surfboard at the end of the video, and how does it taste? If you didn't make it to the end of the video, then congratulations, you have won a brand new custom surfboard, hand-shaped, your choice. It can be an EPS or PU, up to you completely. A shout out and a thank you to all of the members who have joined since our last video, and today we're going to shout out South County, who is the newest member of this small kind channel. A thank you to everybody else who has watched. I'm sorry you didn't win a brand new surfboard, but maybe next time. As always guys, appreciate you very much. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one. Until then, choo-hoo!